Elena Vasquez floated in the observation pod, watching the massive crystalline structure grow larger through the viewport. The Galactic Council Station was beautiful beyond anything humans had ever built. It looked like a giant flower made of pure diamond, spinning slowly around a neutron star. The star's radiation created rainbow patterns across the crystal walls, making the whole station glow like a jewel. "First time seeing it?" asked Captain Torres from the pilot seat. Elena nodded. 2 years of training, but nothing prepared me for this. She had spent those 2 years learning how to communicate without words. The Galactic Confederation had 847 member species, and none of them spoke out loud anymore. They said it was primitive. Advanced beings used light patterns, smell signals, brain waves, and energy pulses to talk. Elena had learned dozens of these methods, but she still felt like a child trying to paint with her feet. The docking process took 3 hours. Everything here moved slowly and carefully. Elena watched as robot arms guided their small human ship into a berth designed for vessels, 100 times larger. Other ships floated nearby, each one stranger than the last. Some looked like living trees with metal roots. Others were perfect geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. One ship seemed to be made entirely of moving water held together by invisible forces. Elena's escort arrived as soon as the airlock opened. The being introduced itself through a series of blue light pulses that Elena's translator converted to meaning. "Welcome, new voice from Small World. This one serves as guide, helper, teacher." The being looked like a tall, thin person made of clear glass filled with swirling galaxies. "Thank you," Elena said out loud, then quickly switched to the proper light pattern response. Her escort's form flickered with what she had learned meant surprise and mild disgust. They traveled through corridors that seemed to go on forever. The walls showed scenes from different worlds, purple oceans under twin suns, cities that floated in clouds, forests where the trees were made of living crystal. Elena saw other beings moving through the corridors, but none of them made any sound. Some glowed, others left trails of colored mist, and a few seemed to bend space around them as they moved. "The Great Chamber," her escort announced through light pulses as they approached enormous doors that opened like flower petals. Elena stepped inside and gasped. The chamber was a perfect sphere, maybe a mile across. Seats floated at different levels throughout the space, each one designed for a different type of being. At the center hung a smaller crystal sphere that pulsed with gentle light. The wall showed the star outside, making it feel like they were floating in space itself. Hundreds of beings were already present. Elena recognized some species from her training. The tall white Altarians who communicated through sound waves too high for human ears. The Veltar who looked like walking flowers and spoke through chemical scents. And the ancient Kethmor who were basically living rocks that talked through magnetic fields. Her seat was near the outer edge of the sphere, which she now understood was where the newest, least important members sat. She activated her translation device and watched as the session began. What followed was the most beautiful and pointless thing Elena had ever witnessed. The current issue was something called the Zephyrian Expansion. Elena had read the files during her journey. The Zephyrian Empire was taking over star systems that belonged to smaller species. Millions of people had been forced from their homes. Entire worlds were being strip-mined. It was, in simple terms, an invasion that was causing massive suffering, but the Council didn't discuss it that way. The Altarian delegate began with a light display that took 20 minutes. Elena's translator worked hard to convert it. In the harmonious consideration of territorial boundaries, one must contemplate the flowing nature of space itself, where lines drawn by limited perception may not reflect the deeper truths of cosmic ownership. Elena blinked. It took 20 minutes to say basically nothing. Next came a Veltar representative who released clouds of scented chemicals. The translation came through as, "The fragrance of disputed worlds carries notes of ancient claims, where the perfume of history mingles with the bouquet of present needs, creating a complex aroma that requires careful analysis by refined senses." Helena checked her notes. The Zephyrians had invaded Veltar colonies 6 months ago. They were harvesting Veltar young for some kind of industrial process. But instead of saying, "They're killing our children," the Veltar delegate was talking about perfume and history. The pattern continued for hours. Each species took their turn to create elaborate displays that said nothing concrete. The Zephyrian delegate, a being that looked like a living crystal sculpture, responded with rainbow light patterns that Elena's translator converted as, "The beauty of expansion reflects the natural growth of crystalline perfection, where lesser formations must inevitably give way to higher organizational structures." Elena realized they were talking about genocide as if it were interior decorating. During a break, Elena accessed her personal files and read reports from the refugee camps. 30 million beings were packed into temporary shelters across 17 different worlds. Children had been separated from their parents. Entire cultures were disappearing. Food supplies were running low and diseases were spreading. But when the session resumed, the debate continued in the same beautiful, meaningless way. A Kethmore delegate created magnetic field patterns that translated as, "The stone-deep wisdom of eons suggests that hasty responses to territorial adjustments may disturb the careful balance that has maintained galactic harmony for millennia." Elena watched a small display screen showing news feeds from the crisis zones. Refugee ships were arriving every day. Medical supplies were running out. Some camps were reporting deaths from preventable diseases. She looked around the chamber at the hundreds of advanced beings creating their light shows and scent clouds and energy patterns. They were so focused on making their communication beautiful and refined that they had forgotten how to actually say anything useful. The Altarian delegate began another display, this one apparently about the philosophical implications of resource redistribution in contested cosmic territories. Elena translated this in her head as, "Should we maybe ask them to stop stealing everything?" But even that simple question was buried under layers of artistic interpretation and cultural refinement. The whole display would take 4 hours to complete, and by Elena's calculation, it would contain maybe 3 minutes worth of actual information. She thought about her training, about the years she had spent learning to communicate like these advanced beings. She thought about the refugees dying while the council created beautiful art instead of making decisions. Elena looked at her translation device, then at the rainbow patterns filling the chamber, then at the news feeds showing suffering across dozens of worlds. For the first time since arriving, she began to wonder if humanity's primitive way of communication might actually be better than all this beautiful complexity. The thought scared her. Everything she had been taught said that advanced civilizations had evolved past crude vocal communication. Speaking out loud was something only primitive species did. But as she watched another hour of elaborate light patterns that said absolutely nothing about the actual crisis, Elena began to think that maybe primitive wasn't always wrong. Maybe sometimes you needed to be simple to be clear. Maybe sometimes you needed to be direct to be honest. Maybe sometimes you needed to make noise to be heard. Elena had been attending council sessions for 3 weeks when the breaking point came. Each day she watched the same beautiful, pointless displays. Each night, she read reports about the worsening refugee crisis. The Zephyrians had invaded 2 more systems, and the refugee count had risen to 37 million. The council's response was to form a subcommittee to study the artistic implications of territorial boundary discussions. Elena sat in her assigned seat, watching the session begin like all the others. Today, the Altarian delegate was scheduled to present their 7-hour interpretive display on the sacred nature of border sanctity. Elena had read the summary. It would be a light show about why borders were important, but it would take all day to say what could be said in 10 minutes. She looked at her personal screen. A new report had just come in from the Kepler 438 refugee camp. A disease outbreak had started because there wasn't enough clean water. 63 beings had died in the past day, mostly children. The Altarian delegate began their display. Waves of colored light flowed across the chamber, creating patterns that looked like abstract art. Elena's translator worked to convert the light into meaning. In the deep wisdom of our ancestors, who walked between stars when the universe was young, we find the eternal truth that boundaries are not mere lines in space. but sacred expressions of the divine right of each species to exist in harmony with the cosmic order. Elena watched the beautiful lights and felt sick. 63 beings had died while they talked about cosmic order. The light display continued, creating images of perfect geometric shapes that represented the mathematical beauty of territorial organization. Elena's screen showed photos from the camps, beings sleeping on bare ground, long lines for tiny amounts of food, medical tents overflowing with sick refugees. The art of boundary making, the display continued, requires the careful consideration of aesthetic principles, where each line drawn in space must reflect the deeper harmonies of galactic civilization. More photos appeared on Elena's screen. A Veltar child, barely alive, separated from its parent cluster. A family of rock beings from Kepler 452b. Their natural crystal formations cracked from malnutrition. Elena looked around the chamber. Every being was focused on the light show with what seemed like deep concentration. Some were creating small, light patterns of their own in response. Apparently, this was how they showed agreement or added their own thoughts to the discussion. The Altarians' display reached its 4th hour. They were now discussing the philosophical implications of line drawing in multidimensional spacetime. Elena's translator was struggling to make sense of it, but as far as she could tell, they were debating whether borders should be measured. In 3 dimensions or 4, Elena's screen chimed softly. Another update from the camps. Food supplies would run out completely in 6 days unless new shipments arrived. But the shipping lanes were blocked by Zephyrian military vessels, who claimed they were maintaining territorial security during the transition period. The translation of that was simple. They were starving the refugees on purpose. Elena stood up. Every being in the chamber continued watching the light display. Standing during another delegate's presentation wasn't exactly forbidden, but it was considered rude. Elena had learned that the proper response to boredom or disagreement was to create subtle counter patterns in your own communication method. But Elena didn't create light patterns. She didn't release chemical scents or adjust her electromagnetic field. She opened her mouth and spoke. Stop. The single word hit the chamber like a physical force. The Altarians' light display flickered and went out completely. Hundreds of beings turned to stare at Elena with expressions of shock and horror. The chamber's ancient translation systems, which hadn't been used for spoken language in over 1,000 years, struggled to life with electronic grinding sounds. Elena had committed the ultimate breach of protocol. She had made noise. Stop, she said again, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's perfect acoustics. Just stop. The Zephyrian delegate, the crystal being who had been creating rainbow patterns for weeks, began to flicker rapidly with what Elena recognized as distress signals. Other beings started creating emergency light patterns and scent signals. Some of the energy-based species actually began to fade, as if the sound waves were physically painful to them. But Elena didn't stop. While you dance, people die, she said, her voice growing stronger. While you glow and pulse and create beautiful light shows, entire worlds are burning. I've watched you spend 3 weeks saying nothing with perfect elegance. The chamber erupted in chaos. Some species literally recoiled from Elena as if she were emitting poison. Others seemed frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. The ancient Kethmore began producing magnetic fields so strong that Elena's translation device started sparking. The Veltar delegate released a chemical cloud that Elena's translator identified as extreme distress mixed with fascination. Several of the energy beings began to pulse in patterns that meant violation of sacred order. But Elena kept talking. 37 million refugees, she said. 63 died yesterday because there's no clean water in the camps. The Zephyrians are blocking food shipments. Children are starving while you debate the philosophical implications of drawing lines in space. Her voice seemed to grow louder, though she wasn't shouting. The chamber's acoustics were designed to carry sound perfectly. They had been built for species who actually spoke, back when the Confederation was young and primitive communication was still allowed. 6 months, Elena continued. 6 months of beautiful displays about territorial sanctity and cosmic harmony. 6 months of light shows and scent clouds and energy patterns that say absolutely nothing about the actual problem. You've turned communication into art and art into meaninglessness. The Altarian delegate tried to restart their light display, creating desperate patterns that meant proper protocol must be restored. But Elena's voice cut through their display like it wasn't even there. "The Zephyrians are committing genocide," she said, using the simple, ugly word that none of the advanced species would say directly. "They're killing people and taking their worlds. That's not territorial adjustment or resource redistribution or cosmic reorganization. It's mass murder." The Zephyrian delegate's crystalline form began to vibrate in a way that Elena had never seen before. Other beings were creating emergency signals, calling for security, demanding that Elena be removed from the chamber. But something else was happening too. Elena noticed that some of the light patterns and scent signals weren't expressions of outrage. They were something else entirely. They were responses to what she was actually saying. The chamber's ancient translation systems, struggling to convert vocal speech into the various sensory languages of 847 species, were doing something they hadn't done in centuries. They were carrying not just words, but the emotion behind the words, the urgency, the anger, the desperate hope that someone somewhere might actually listen and act. Elena realized that her simple, primitive human speech was doing something that all the beautiful, refined communication couldn't do. It was telling the truth. Elena's voice filled the chamber as she continued speaking, her words cutting through centuries of refined protocol like a blade through silk. She talked about the refugee camps she had studied, describing them in simple, direct terms that made the reality impossible to ignore. "There's a camp on Kepler 438b with 2 million Veltar refugees," she said. "They're living in shelters made from scrap metal because their forest cities were burned for fuel. The children can't create their chemical sense properly because they're malnourished. They're losing their ability to communicate with their parents." The Veltar delegate in the chamber released a chemical signal so strong that Elena's eyes watered. Through her translator, it came across as raw grief, not the refined, artistic expression of sorrow they usually created, but something primal and desperate. "The Kethmore from the Vega system," Elena continued, "their crystal formations are breaking down because they can't find the mineral nutrients they need. They're literally crumbling to dust, and their young ones are being born incomplete. Entire bloodlines that have existed for millions of years are ending in refugee camps." Around the chamber, Elena noticed the massive Kethmore delegates beginning to vibrate. The sound was low and deep like the groaning of mountains. Elena had never heard them make noise before. They usually communicated through magnetic fields. But now they were producing something that sounded almost like crying, if rocks could cry. "You want to know about border sanctity?" Elena asked, turning toward the Altarian delegate who had been interrupted. "The Zephyrians aren't just crossing borders, they're erasing them. They're taking worlds that have been home to species for millions of years and turning them into mining operations. They're not expanding their territory, they're destroying everyone else's." The Altarian's tall, graceful form began to pulse with white light, but not in the controlled patterns Elena had learned to recognize. This was something else, rapid, chaotic flashes that her translator couldn't even convert into meaning. Elena realized that her words weren't just being translated into the different communication methods of the various species. Something else was happening. The chamber itself seemed to be amplifying her voice, making it resonate in ways that bypassed the normal translation process. "I've read the reports," Elena said, pulling out her personal device and reading directly from it. "Medical report from Kepler 442c. Zephyrian mining operations are using captured Threx workers as living tools. The silicon-based beings are being dissolved in acid baths to extract rare minerals from their bodies. Estimated casualties, 40,000 in the past month." A section of the chamber where the Threx delegates sat suddenly filled with a sound Elena had never heard before, like glass breaking mixed with wind chimes. The Threx were creating crystal formations that cracked as soon as they formed, over and over again. Elena kept reading. "Intelligence report from the Andromedas sector. Zephyrian forces are systematically targeting nursery worlds, planets where Young beings are raised communally. They're harvesting the young for biological components. Species affected include Veltar, Draconis, and Centauri variants. Estimated loss of young, over 2 million. The chemical chaos that erupted from the Veltar section was overwhelming. Elena's translator gave up trying to convert it, simply displaying extreme distress, multiple overlapping signals, unable to process. But Elena didn't need a translation. She could feel the grief and rage radiating from them. "You've made communication so beautiful," Elena said, her voice rising, "that it's become meaningless. You've perfected the art of saying nothing while sounding profound. But ugliness has its place too. Pain has its place. Anger has its place. These aren't refined emotions, but they're real ones." Something unprecedented began to happen. The chambers, acoustics designed centuries ago to showcase the primitive vocal species when they were first admitted to the Confederation, started to create harmonics. Elena's voice wasn't just being heard, it was being transformed into frequencies that resonated with the natural communication methods of every species present. The Altarian delegates suddenly stopped their light display entirely and produced a sound, an actual audible sound that Elena felt in her bones. Through her translator it came as, "We lost our homeworld to them 40 years ago. We've been trying to say it through proper channels, but the light patterns for systematic extermination are considered too harsh for civilized discourse." Elena stared at them. "You lost your homeworld 40 years ago and you've never said it directly?" More sounds began to emerge from around the chamber. The Kethmore delegates produced grinding, crushing noises that translated as descriptions of worlds, being literally broken apart for their mineral content. The energy-based plasma riders began to flicker in patterns that showed star systems being drained of their energy, leaving dead space behind. Elena realized that every species in the chamber had stories like this. The Zephyrian expansion had been going on for decades, maybe centuries. But their communication protocols were so focused on politeness and artistic beauty that no one had ever been able to say directly what was happening to them. "How long?" Elena asked. "How long have they been doing this?" The Zephyrian delegate, who had been silent through Elena's entire speech, finally responded. But instead of their usual rainbow light patterns, they produced a sound, a crystalline chiming that somehow managed to carry smugness and contempt. Elena's translator converted. The lesser-formed beings have always been available for higher purposes. The surprise is not that we use them efficiently, but that the Council has tolerated their noise-making this long. The chamber exploded. Every species began communicating at once, but not in their refined, protocol-approved methods. They were making sounds, actual sounds, raw and unfiltered. The Veltar were producing chemical signals so intense that the air itself became visible with colored mist. The Kethmore were generating magnetic fields strong enough to make metal objects around the chamber vibrate. But most importantly, Elena's voice continued to carry above it all, amplified by the chamber's ancient acoustic properties and somehow harmonized with every other form of communication happening simultaneously. "Sometimes," Elena said, her voice now reaching every corner of the vast chamber, "the most advanced thing you can do is speak simply, truthfully, and from the heart. Sometimes primitive is better than pretty. Sometimes noise is more honest than silence." The resonance building in the chamber was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Elena could feel it in her bones, in her mind, in her soul. Her words weren't just being heard. They were being amplified and harmonized by the desperate honesty of 846 species, finally saying what they really meant instead of what protocol required them to mean. The chamber had become something no one had ever seen before. A perfect storm of communication where every species was finally saying what they actually meant. Elena's voice had become the catalyst, but now it was being joined by sounds and signals from beings who hadn't communicated honestly in centuries. Elena watched as the sophisticated translation systems throughout the chamber began to overload. These systems had been designed to handle the slow, artistic communications of refined species. They had never been built to process hundreds of different communication methods all expressing raw emotion at the same time. But something amazing happened as the systems failed. Without the filters of translation protocol, the different species began to understand each other directly. The grief chemicals from the Veltar mixed with the magnetic distress fields from the Kethmore and the sonic pain calls from the Altarians, creating a harmony of shared suffering that needed no translation. Elena realized she was witnessing something that evolutionary biologists had only theorized about: empathic cascade resonance. When beings communicated their deepest truths without cultural filters, they could create a shared emotional field that transcended species barriers. The ancient Kethmore delegate, a being whose rocky form was older than human civilization, produced a magnetic pulse so strong it made Elena's teeth ache. But her failing translator managed to convert part of it. 3 million years we have existed. In all that time we learned to speak quietly, politely, properly. We forgot how to scream. This small species female has reminded us that sometimes screaming is the only honest response. A plasma rider, one of the energy beings that usually appeared as barely visible clouds of light, suddenly blazed so brightly that Elena had to shield her eyes. The energy patterns it created were nothing like their usual refined pulses. These were raw, chaotic bursts that somehow conveyed the story of entire star systems being drained of energy, of fellow energy beings being consumed as fuel. They eat us. The plasma rider's message came through Elena's overloaded translator. They built machines that trap our kind and burn us for power. We tried to explain this through proper energy harmonics for 60 years. No one understood that efficient energy conversion meant genocide. Elena felt the chamber's resonance growing stronger. Her voice was no longer the only human element in this cacophony. The chamber itself seemed to be responding to the honesty, amplifying not just sound but emotion, not just words but truth. A group of Veltar delegates released a coordinated chemical signal that told the story Elena had been trying to explain for weeks. But instead of the refined scent poetry they usually created, this was raw and immediate. Elena's translator identified compounds for child death, parent grief, species extinction, and desperate hope. The smell was overwhelming and horrible, and absolutely honest. Our young are not biological resources, the chemical message said. They are our children. When you harvest them for industrial processes, you are murdering our babies. We have been trying to say this politely for 6 months. There is no polite way to say that you are killing our children. Helena looked around the chamber and saw something she had never expected. The refined, advanced beings who had spent centuries perfecting beautiful communication were crying. Not all of them had tears the way humans did, but each species was expressing grief in their own way. The Altarians' light bodies flickered like candles in wind. The Kethmore developed stress fractures in their rocky surfaces. The energy beings dimmed almost to nothing. But in the center of the chamber, the Zephyrian delegate remained unmoved. Their crystalline form continued to produce those smug, contemptuous chimes. Elena's translator was working just well enough to convert their message. Emotional displays are proof of evolutionary inadequacy. Advanced beings should be above such primitive responses. The Confederation will restore order and proper protocol. That's when Elena realized something important. The Zephyrian wasn't creating light patterns or energy pulses or any of the advanced communication methods. They were making sounds, chimes and crystalline notes. They had always been making sounds, but they had convinced the galaxy that their sounds were more sophisticated than everyone else's. "You're not more advanced than us," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chaos with sudden clarity. "You just convinced everyone that your way of making noise was better than theirs. But it's still just noise." The Zephyrian's chiming became more aggressive, more complex. But Elena could hear it now for what it really was. Not advanced communication, but the same kind of simple sound-making that every species did naturally. "The difference," Elena continued, "is that we use our noise to tell the truth. You use yours to hide it." The resonance in the chamber was building to something Elena could feel in her bones. Every species was now contributing to a growing wave of honest communication that seemed to be feeding back on itself, getting stronger with each voice that joined it. Elena realized that the chamber's design was no accident. When it was built, thousands of years ago, it had been created during an era when vocal communication was still common. The acoustics weren't just for carrying sound. They were built to create exactly this kind of resonance, where multiple forms of communication could harmonize and amplify each other. The ancient architects had known that someday, the galaxy might need to remember how to speak honestly again. "This is what real communication looks like," Elena said, her voice now carrying the harmonics of hundreds of species. "Not beautiful, not refined, not artistic, just true." The wave of resonance reached a crescendo that Elena felt might shatter the chamber itself. Every being present was communicating with absolute honesty for the first time in centuries, and the combined force of their truth was creating something unprecedented in galactic history. Elena's simple human words, amplified by the desperate honesty of 846 species, became something larger than speech. They became a declaration that truth was more important than beauty, that clarity was more valuable than sophistication, and that sometimes the most primitive response was the most advanced answer. The galaxy was about to remember how to feel. Elena's final words came not as a shout, but as something quieter and more powerful. The kind of simple truth that could only be spoken, not displayed or performed or refined into art. "Sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is speak simply, truthfully and from the heart," she said. "Sometimes the most sophisticated response is the most honest one. Sometimes primitive is exactly what progress looks like." As she spoke those words, the resonance in the chamber reached a point that none of the ancient architects could have imagined. The crystalline structure itself began to vibrate, not with stress or damage, but with harmonic amplification. The chamber had become a perfect resonating crystal, and Elena's voice was the frequency that made it sing. But the chamber wasn't isolated. It was connected to the Confederation's quantum communication network, the system that allowed instant contact. Across the galaxy, every word Elena spoke, every emotional harmonic created by the 846 species responding to her, was being broadcast through quantum entanglement to every world, every ship, every station connected to the network. Elena's simple human speech, combined with the desperate honesty of the entire Galactic Council, echoed across thousands of light years in an instant. On Kepler 438b, in the refugee camps Elena had described, something unprecedented happened. The human volunteers who had been working there, dismissed by local officials as noisemakers who didn't understand proper protocol, suddenly found that when they spoke about the refugees' needs, people listened. The Veltar camp administrators, hearing human voices without the filter of cultural prejudice for the first time, finally understood what the humans had been trying to tell them about medical supplies and food distribution. On Zephyrian worlds, the crystalline citizens who had been told that the expansion was a civilizing mission heard Elena's words amplified by their own communication networks. For the first time, they heard the voices of the refugees, not translated through official channels, but broadcast directly through the quantum network. They heard Veltar children calling for their parents, Kethmore elders describing the pain of watching their home mountains being ground to dust, Altarian survivors singing funeral songs for their destroyed worlds. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Zephyrian citizens began to understand that their empire's territorial expansion was actually mass murder on a galactic scale. The crystalline beings, who prided themselves on their logical perfection, found themselves facing an emotion their species had tried to eliminate: shame. Back in the council chamber, Elena watched as the Zephyrian delegates' form began to change. The smug, contemptuous chiming faded to silence, and their crystal body started to develop stress fractures, the Zephyrian equivalent of crying. We believed," the delegate managed to say, their chimes now broken and uncertain. "We believed that advancement meant elimination of inefficiency. We classified other species as resources. We did not understand that resources they could feel." Elena realized that the Zephyrians hadn't been evil in the way humans understood evil. They had been operating from a logic system that classified emotional response as evolutionary weakness. They had convinced themselves that beings who felt pain weren't truly sentient. Elena's speech, amplified by the honest grief of their victims, had forced them to confront the reality of what they had done. The quantum network carried this revelation across Zephyrian space. Crystal cities that had celebrated efficient resource extraction began to understand that they had been celebrating genocide. The Empire's military, designed to suppress emotional responses as weaknesses, found themselves overwhelmed by feelings they had no training to process. Within hours, Zephyrian fleets across the galaxy began to stand down, not because of military threats or diplomatic pressure, but because they could no longer pretend that their victims weren't people. The Council's vote, when it finally came, wasn't conducted through elaborate ritual or artistic display. It was simple, direct, and devastating. Each species created a single pulse: yes or no, stop the Zephyrians or allow them to continue. The vote took 3 minutes instead of 3 days, and it wasn't even close. Species voted to stop the expansion. Only one voted to continue it. The Zephyrian delegate abstained, but the real change wasn't in the council chamber. Across the galaxy, something fundamental had shifted. Species that had spent centuries refining their communication into elaborate art forms began to remember that the point of communication was to be understood, not to be beautiful. Human diplomatic corps, previously considered a curiosity because of their primitive vocal communication, suddenly found themselves in desperate demand. Every species wanted humans to help them communicate with their own people, with other species, with anyone who needed to hear simple truth instead of refined art. Elena returned to Earth 6 months later to find that humanity's role in the galaxy had completely transformed. They were no longer the newest, most primitive members of the Confederation. They had become the galaxy's translators, the beings who could help advanced species remember how to say what they actually meant. The refugee crisis ended not through complex diplomatic negotiations, but through direct action. When beings could speak honestly about suffering, they could also speak honestly about solutions. Food shipments reached the camps because ship captains could say, "People are starving," instead of creating elaborate displays about nutritional distribution challenges. Elena established the Vasquez Doctrine, the recognition that communication complexity should serve understanding, not replace it. Galactic diplomatic protocols were rewritten to include primitive methods like vocal speech, written words, and direct emotional expression. The Zephyrian Empire transformed from a conquest-based system to something unprecedented, a civilization, trying to make amends for crimes they finally understood they had committed. Their perfect crystal cities became refugee centers, their mining operations became restoration projects, and their military became a rescue fleet. But perhaps the most important change was simpler. The galaxy had remembered that the most advanced communication wasn't the most beautiful or sophisticated. It was the most honest. Species began to talk to each other the way they actually felt, not the way protocol demanded they should feel. Elena often stood in the rebuilt council chamber, watching debates that were loud and messy and sometimes ugly, but always real. She had learned that evolution didn't always mean becoming more complex. Sometimes it meant remembering what made you conscious in the first place. Sometimes, when a human diplomat spoke with simple honesty, the entire silence of a sophisticated galaxy could echo with the power of rediscovered truth. And that echo could change everything.